Good afternoon. This is Thomas Miller. I'm Senior Counsel here at the Nixon Law Group. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a quick disclaimer that the information provided during this webinar is not and does not constitute legal advice. It's all for informational purposes, which may not be the most up-to-date, but we try. But nothing in this presentation is intended to establish or create an attorney-client relationship. With that out of the way, I want to introduce my co-panelists. Again, I am Tommy Miller. I am Senior Counsel and Life Science Practice Lead here at Nixon Law Group. I am joined today by Dr. John Lazo, who is a distinguished professor of pharmacology and chemistry at the University of Virginia. He is also the Chief Scientific Officer of a company called Keverex, which is focused on oncology products. I am also joined today by Nikki Hastings, who's the Executive Director of Seville BioHub, which is an association in the Charlottesville, Virginia area, an incredible organization that's linking life science companies and biotech companies and really fostering a collaboration in the life science ecosystem here in Virginia. Today, we're going to be talking about innovating in an emergency, which we all know to be COVID-19. We're going to talk about how it's impacting current drug development and how it's likely to impact drug development in the future.
I wanted to jump in and first at least start by talking about COVID-19. We've been hearing a lot about it right now, and it has done a lot in our industry to really upset a lot of drug developments, mostly because you have doctors' offices that are shut down, hospitals that are shut down, and it's just not safe for people to get on site. And we have various reasons why that's happening right now. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background on what it takes to actually bring a drug product to market or a device to market. And the primary authority, as most everybody would know, is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And under the authorities and regulations under that particular statute, for drugs to come to market, they have to be approved through a showing of substantial evidence. Well, that usually means about 2 clinical trials that support both the safety and efficacy of the product. For devices, that's clear, credible, and reliable evidence. It's a lower standard, but it still takes clinical data, non-clinical data, validation, and all of that amounts to time and money that a lot of manufacturers have to invest in their products before those go into market. And right now, that doesn't necessarily change because we have a public health emergency. Those products still have to go through those regulatory pathways to be approved and be able to get onto market, to be able to show that they're effective to treat what it is they're intended to treat. That doesn't mean that we don't have products on the market right now that are intended to help with the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw is the FDA has drafted dozens of guidance documents ranging on various issues, including step-by-step instructions for manufacturers to develop various treatments or diagnostic tests. You also have a lot of enforcement discretion guidelines going out right now, which essentially says that these unapproved products, the FDA is going to look the other way for right now without requiring that some of these products receive formal approval or clearance or anything like that. And again, that's a discretionary enforcement environment. It doesn't mean that the FDA is reviewing these products in any way. They're not usually even aware that some of these products are hitting the market under these enforcement guidelines, which is a little different than what we see in emergency use authorizations, which I think is what we see the majority of and what a lot of the media is talking about right now. Are these diagnostic tests or these treatments or antibody tests. All of these things are being allowed to be in the market right now because of an emergency use authorization. And that means that the Secretary Azar right now of the Department of Health and Human Services has determined that the COVID-19 pandemic poses a significant amount of an emergency to the public health, that the FDA commissioner can allow unapproved products to be used in the market to try to alleviate or mitigate the effects of the pandemic. And so again, we see certain antibody tests or viral diagnostic tests, even now laboratory developed tests that have to go through some sort of an emergency use authorization to be used by the public. It's not a robust review. They don't have the time to go through the full scientific review for these products. So we've noticed a few issues with some of the products being pushed out. But the FDA is still working actively through some expedited approval pathways that would allow some products to gain full market approval, get approved to be used, most notably in the areas of vaccines and actual treatments for individuals who are diagnosed with COVID-19, to be able to be readily available in the public and start being manufactured and distributed. Which is really hard to balance. I think as we start talking with John and Nikki, we'll kind of understand from the front lines that the public perceptions and those perceptions that are being pushed out in media and those perceptions that are echoed in some of the scientific communities is that they're a little bit at odds. I remember first starting in pharma and becoming more attuned with the scientific standards. And I remember a colleague of mine at the time was coming out as a chemistry professor, was, always reassure me that, science is not a very fast endeavor, and the science does not change overnight. And I think what we see a lot in the media is the push and the race to develop some sort of treatment or vaccine for COVID-19 probably a lot sooner than it's actually going to be able to be commercially feasible. It takes, if you remember the evidence that's needed, we still have to go through these clinical trials. We still have to test safety. We still have to find out whether or not the particular drug targets are effective at treating this particular novel coronavirus. And to be able to do that, we have to have the data, which means we have to have the patients, and we have to run the analysis on that data to be able to make that determination. So even as we talk about, the most recent news about Moderna's vaccine and the push to get a vaccine out within 12 to 18 months, that seems to still be warp speed time frame, but everybody is kind of wrapped up in this very quick time frame. And just to give some historical perspective, one of the reasons I really got involved in life science was around the Ebola outbreak back in 2014. And anybody who was following that at the time understands, it took 5 years to get some sort of a commercialized vaccine for Ebola. And that was even considered to be a very quick vaccine for that particular pathogen. And so when we talk about these timelines, it's really good to keep perspective on what it takes to evaluate a certain product and get it into market so that people who are using it can be assured that there is some level of efficacy to it. They're not wasting their money, and they're not getting a treatment that actually doesn't do anything and then continue to spread the disease or cause more harm to themselves than they otherwise would without taking medication. Which leads me into the next point. We see a lot of inaccurate tests. The news just came out about certain diagnostic tests having a almost 50% false negative rate. And if you think about how easily this virus has been spread from person to person, having 50% of people get a test readout that they're negative for the virus, and then continue to go out and mix with people or relax their ideas on social distancing, that is continuing to spread the disease when they could have or should have been able to get a test that could have accurately predicted or accurately diagnosed an active viral infection. Again, it's probably because of the speed at which these things are being developed and the idea that we should be trying to use anything that we can and that something is better than nothing. But I think it really, really highlights the importance of going through the process and understanding the data on how these products are working for the drug, for the particular pathogen that they're intended to treat. And then the other idea, we've seen several rounds of massive spending bills being passed in Congress recently, part of it going right to companies and people in the public to help stave off some of the economic crisis. But there has been a ton of funding going to various different agencies of the government to support research in infectious disease or for manufacturing of US-based active pharmaceutical ingredients, or the ramping up of manufacturing of everything from ventilators to masks to gloves to swabs. All of these efforts have been pushed recently in these spending bills, which is all very much needed, but the mindset there that this is a bailout needs to shift to being the norm. When you think about, for example, the agency that nobody has ever heard of until COVID-19 is BARDA, and now everybody's talking about BARDA because it is the primary agency that is responsible for funding and overseeing research in areas like infectious diseases. When you think about the next global influenza pandemic or the next coronavirus pandemic, because this is probably not going to be the last one, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, these are all infectious diseases that BARDA is tasked with keeping an eye on and funding research into trying to develop preventative measures to keep these types of global pandemics from taking hold and having some sort of, another huge impact to public health. I believe that agency probably is well underfunded on any given day, and probably needs a lot more private companies to participate and add funding and be a part of the infectious disease conversation, especially around new research and trying to, again, keep things like COVID-19 from happening in the future. So that's what I think has gotten us to where we are. I think that's the current state of where we are. We're in a position where there are some good candidates for treatments, good candidates for vaccines, but we still have to walk through the approval processes for these treatments and drugs to make sure that the public is aware that they are going to be safe and effective when it comes down to being used. Now, to be able to do that, we have to have robust discovery programs, and that is also something, like I mentioned at the outset, has been very hard to navigate through COVID-19. I think as I turn this over to John, we think about all the testing and data and science that goes into what we just talked about in developing a drug. Now try to understand how this might play out in the labs when you can't even be around your colleagues and everybody's working from home and those things. So I'm going to turn it over to John Lazo now, and he's going to walk us through his perspectives on how we're looking at preclinical discovery, mostly related to academic research.
Tommy, thank you very much for that wonderful overview of the regulatory landscape, and also for this opportunity to be able to discuss this really important topic. I think that I can say with a lot of certitude that this is one of the most remarkable, dynamic periods that I've seen in my entire career with respect to drug discovery, and probably what I say today may be out of date tomorrow. This is a little bit anecdotal, but I'll try to cover some of the terrain as I see it, both in academic drug discovery and also as it relates at least to our company, Keeberex. So if we move to the next slide, I'll give you a couple of points. I don't know if do I control it? Good. So I'd like to take the perspective of discussing the impact of COVID-19 on research going on in the research-intensive universities in Virginia. I've been in contact with my colleagues at GMU, at Virginia Commonwealth, Virginia Tech, and Old Dominion. And I know at the University of Virginia and all of those other institutions, they've been essentially closed for the last more than 2 months. By that, I mean that ongoing research activities in some of those institutions have allowed to occur, but no new research activities. And in my own personal lab, we were required to terminate a rather large mouse experiment because we were anticipating that we would not be able to get to the vivarium and continue the studies, and we were worried about wasting resources. So that's a pretty significant impact. You know from reading the newspapers and watching the news that there's a tremendous impact with respect to revenue to universities. At the University of Virginia, it was announced that we are losing in our health system $3 million a month, and this has resulted in salary reductions, 20% salary reduction for faculty, and some furloughing that has occurred. I've talked to my friends at Virginia Tech, and they have not experienced salary reductions at this point or furloughing, but the impact of whether students will come back in the fall and finances, I think, have really stressed universities with respect to maintaining their research activities. I will tell you that at the University of Virginia, we've begun a phase-in of research activities. We're in phase 1 with approval from our schools. This goes all the way up to phase 4, which I would say is essentially accommodating the kinds of activities that we had prior to COVID-19. But for example, in my laboratory, undergraduates are not allowed to be in the laboratory until phase 4 occurs. So pretty significant impact on our research activities. Many, as I mentioned earlier, many drug discovery and development activities been suspended, as well as clinical trials. So new clinical trials, at least again, based on my experience at the University of Virginia, have been paused. And many of the ongoing activities that require patients to come into the hospital and receive infusion have been affected. And graduate and postgraduate education clearly has been impacted. We continue to have Zoom meetings with respect to thesis defenses and undergraduate research activities, but this is quite a bit different than what we had prior to COVID. And I'm happy to discuss that further if people have questions in the question and answer period. Most of the federal granting agencies, particularly the National Institutes of Health, have been very accommodating with an understanding of our situation. I know that in the case of my SBIR grant with the National Cancer Institute, we've been given a 1-year no-cost extension, in part because of the COVID situation. And we believe that these similar kinds of understandings with federal agencies will occur with most of our funding grants. Yes, I guess I already covered the phase 1, phase 2. Again, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the no-cost extensions if people are interested in discussing that. Next
John,
slide.
I have a quick question.
Yes, go right ahead.
When you talk about, for example, the impact it had on the mouse colony that you had started, and you had to put down the mouse colony at the very beginning of this, talk to me about the expense and the time setback there. What's the delay in having to do that sort of thing?
Well, this was an experiment that was designed to look at efficacy in a preclinical mouse model. We had about 50 mice that we were planning to test. The purchasing of the mice, and when you purchase them, you have to maintain them prior to the study, which takes usually 2 weeks or so before the study's initiated. Had we pulled the trigger on the study, the study would have cost us approximately $20,000 prior to pulling the trigger. That is to say, starting the injections and monitoring the mice. We were already invested up about $4,000 to $5,000.
Yeah.
In terms of delay of the experiments, when we get back to feeling confident that we can conduct the studies, it will take us at least 2 months to order the mice, if ordering is not disrupted. I don't know. And so I would say that it's fair to say that it's delayed that project at least four or so months, and will have cost us, probably $10,000. This is not including shutting down all cell culture studies, and then restarting those. So it's a delay of at least 3 or 4 or 5 months, I would say.
And that's once you actually get started, depending on how long the actual
correct.
time
now
takes. Yeah.
We are, as I mentioned earlier, in phase 1. We are starting to thaw cells out and in anticipation of moving to phase 2.
Yeah.
We have to fill out forms. We have to get approval from our deans that we have the appropriate safety plans in place. And even then, we'll have social distancing. And so we will not be having 10 people in the lab at one time.
Right.
Okay, does that help you?
Yeah, thank you for that.
And my friends at Virginia Tech, the email I got this morning said that they do not at this point have a clear plan to restart laboratory functions. I'm not sure what's happening at VCU and some of the other research-oriented institutions, and I suspect some of the people in the audience can weigh in on that if they would like. But these things are changing very quickly. Yeah. So I don't think there's any question that COVID-19 has retarded our academic drug discovery and development efforts. I believe there are going to be winners and losers. By that I mean some people are trying to learn from this COVID experience. And I know in my own personal research, we've now relied heavily on Zoom conferences, and that's allowed actually collaborations to move more among academic and our industrial partners to actually be a little bit more fluid than they were prior to the COVID-19 situation. So I suspect that that will be a positive. As you mentioned earlier, hopefully there's going to be an understanding by the lay population the importance of preparing for and funding research activities. I suspect that infectious diseases are going to receive more attention than they did before.
Yeah.
Some of the pediatric consequences of COVID, I think, will call our attention to the importance of also monitoring and seeking efforts to treat those individuals. So I think that there will be, hopefully, a benefit that is derived from this, that this isn't a transient activity, but one that requires sustained, thoughtful funding. One of my concerns is that we have a moonshot, and then we walk away from that moonshot without and diverting research activities from one area to another area in a temporary way. That would, I think, be sad, and maybe result in losers. I think in Virginia, if I can be parochial about this, we're really blessed to have some wonderful organizations, including VA Bio, the Catalyst program. My understanding, we have a Catalyst application for Keyvarex as a supplement to our SBIR, and that, it seems, is continuing to seek funding for emerging companies. I think the recent movement of the Virginia Center of Innovation and Technologies also will be a big plus. Again, Nikki can probably highlight these better than I can. But I do think that COVID-19 crisis has engaged academic investigators to work with large and small pharmaceutical companies in a way that wasn't as obvious or as robust as it was before. Big pharma like J&J and Pfizer have engaged very intimately with the NIH, and I think in a very appropriate way, and with academics. And I'll just put a plug in for the Virginia Drug Discovery Consortium, which is an interinstitutional organization that would have had its 5th annual meeting this coming Monday. Obviously, that has been suspended. But I do see academics working together to try to build the resources and the ecosystem that would be really important for future discovery and development. Can we have the next slide?
Yeah, so I just wanted to dig in a little bit on that, if you don't mind. I think one of the things that you had discussed with me before is in those inter-institutional relationships. I think here in Virginia, we have a lot of research-heavy institutions, as you discussed, and a lot of drug discovery happens at the academic level. And one of your fears that you mentioned was around funding opportunities. And do you see an opportunity for the sharing of resources among those institutions in the future as we think about research budgets maybe being cut and where one organization may have equipment or abilities that other institutions may not? Do you see an opportunity there for sharing and pooling of these types of resources?
Tommy, I think your question is very prescient and highly appropriate. And that's actually at the core of the Virginia Drug Discovery Consortium. So I'll make a couple of shout outs here and try to highlight how we might be able to do that.
Sure.
Frank Gupton is a leader in APIs, or advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, and flow synthesis. And a lot of the press has been highlighting the outsourcing of API development. And here's an individual at Virginia Commonwealth that has an absolutely remarkable capability of providing large quantities of either advanced pharmaceutical ingredients or even the final product that's unmet at any of our other research institutions that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a wonderful place for productive interactions, and I know Frank and his team at VCU are eager to be able to provide that. Virginia Tech has the only veterinary school in the Commonwealth at the research institutions, and this is a disease that is perpetuated or instigated by vertical transfer, horizontal transfer among animals, and they have world-renowned investigators who study flu pathogenesis, again, providing animal models that would be very valuable. We at the University of Virginia have developed one of the first schools in big data. Capitalizing on that, I think, would be very valuable. And GMU has some wonderful diagnostic technology that could be exploited, should be exploited, and amplified among the different programs. So those are just a few, and I apologize if I've missed some other very obvious ones. We only have, among those institutions, we only have one school of pharmacy, and goodness, shouldn't we be able to capitalize on that at VCU among the other institutions? So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and I think it highlights, we're just one state with those types of with that type of setup, and I imagine that this particular issue is going to arise across the country. And if there's an opportunity to learn and get more cooperation among those resources, especially as we are unsure about the economic status of a lot of state universities, as you know, we question how enrollment decisions are going to be made in coming this fall. I think it's a lesson that could be well learned or well played out in every state, just based on kind of what we're experiencing here in Virginia.
Yeah, and you had mentioned in your slides, how the development of a vaccine from 12 to 18 months is warp speed. Certainly UVA has invested a fair amount of money in vaccine technology, as has some of the other research-intensive organizations, academic organizations. And I might just mention that in discussing our supplement for our SBIR, Kebrex's SBIR, these are going to be reviewed for COVID-19. These supplements are going to be reviewed internally. And my program officer said within 4 weeks, we would know a score. I mean, that is not even warp speed. That's like a galactic wormhole, being able to get the government to fund things that quickly. So pretty unique opportunity for those of us in the Commonwealth to access monies that might be able to repurpose or reorient some of our activities toward dealing with the COVID-19 and future COVID crises.
Yeah. Well, Nikki, thank you, John. I know that you deal with you have a lot of academic perspective. I want to talk to Nikki because I think that she has a lot of insights right now with her association at Vivo BioHub with some of the companies that are operating out of there and their commercial perspectives. So Nikki, what are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Tommy, so much. It's a great opportunity to be here and to hear John's insights from the academic perspective as well. I've been much closer to what's been happening in the industry side, and I speak on behalf of mostly the biotech community from Charlottesville, but also everything that we're all following right now from the therapeutic and vaccine development perspective today. This has been an environment where, one, the biotech community has been able to, where John is saying in the academic centers they've shut down, on the industry side and private sector, they've mostly been able to continue to operate, putting in a lot of best practices for social distancing, even within their own lab environments. And, really, this is a group of trained individuals who understand and have already been employing a lot of the best practices needed for working and operating in a safe way. So I think, for one, that's allowed innovation to happen during this time, both at the therapeutic and vaccine development stage, but also for other treatments for COVID related to medical device needs, ventilators, and the PPE side. So we're seeing innovation happening all over right now. We're seeing companies that, an allergen testing company, Indoor Biotech, they have provided liters upon liters of hand sanitizer for our community because they had access to that supply, as well as they are now developing purified antibodies to be able to use for improving those success rates of the tests that you alluded to, Tommy. Yeah. So, we're seeing pivots where companies say, well, yeah, we can help in this way. And we've been seeing innovation coming even from standard engineering firms that maybe haven't developed medical devices before, but really want to help. Now, there's cautions against that. And I think that's where the FDA and those regulatory processes that you're speaking about today come to play to ensure that what we are bringing to market is done safely and that the outcomes are safe for the patients that those innovations are interacting with. So, you know, even on the manufacturing side, we're seeing there's such a need for manufacturing, and we're seeing companies are innovating on process. We're hearing process innovation happening even at the clinical trial perspective, where, as an example, the Gilead drug remdesivir has been demanded essentially by the public, and people wanting to get access to that as quickly as possible. And so those that are trying to those that are trying to bring that drug to market are trying to find ways through trials to bring broader access by working directly with the physicians who can then prescribe as needed, as opposed to direct to patients. So through those trials. So, you know, we're seeing innovation happening everywhere. There's more demand for thinking outside the box related to the drug development side. You know, we're seeing the makers come out developing new ideas for PPE. We need reusable PPE for the long term here. We're hearing from the hospitals that, you know, they were using plastic garbage bags as isolation gowns. There's a huge shortage of isolation gowns that we're hearing. And if we could find ways to innovate on the materials for that and allow them to be autoclavable or reusable, I think, you know, there's opportunity. So everybody's looking for ways to help. I think it's making sure that we are following guidelines, and those companies are getting the support they need to do it properly, so that when things are getting out there, we're not seeing 50% failure rates in the COVID testing. I think it's really, really important. You highlight that so well. You know, we're seeing an acceleration of process, and everybody keeps saying this is an unprecedented speed, you know, where it typically takes 8 to 10 years to get a drug to market, and over $2 billion in investment funds. And, you know, you so also nicely mentioned that science is not moving at the pace of the demand. And this is definitely a case where we need to be cautious, but, you know, we are seeing ways that the process can be sped up. As John was mentioning, even just in the turnover of reviews on applications for funding, that's going to accelerate the process, right? And you're seeing that even in the clinical trials where they're running these back-to-back phase 1 right into phase 2. I was hearing that generally they would take a time and period to digest that data and information and really make sure that they're setting up the best phase 2 trial that they might be able to move forward. And so I have concerns about, you know, what are we missing in that pause period, but understanding that, you know, there are decisions being made that they're seeing the benefits of accelerating that process outweighing the risks here. And we obviously want to get to vaccines and therapeutics as quickly as possible. You know, the problem with the accelerated process in clinical trials here on COVID-related innovations, we were talking about this earlier, is that it's causing now a backlog and a delay in clinical trials for unrelated COVID-19 therapeutics. And we're hearing that across the board, you know, from the companies that are trying to initiate or trying to work through their clinical trials. So that's happening for 2 reasons, I think, because of the not only those that are currently in clinical trials not wanting to expose themselves by going to centers for testing to continue those trials, those are being halted. And then also on the side of, you know, if we're prioritizing everything COVID-19 related, there obviously is not an increase of activity and resources to look at everything at the same time. You know, we are seeing the faster adoption and approval rates for things. And I think you highlighted that issue with the testing situation, where a lot of things received the emergency use authorization, and then, you know, now we're seeing some of the outcomes of that. I think a real concern is what is the impact if we are accelerating the authorization of some of the drugs. And I think the companies are taking that responsibility very, very seriously. Gilead with remdesivir for sure is kind of one of the leaders in in that activity. Across the board, there are unprecedented collaborations as well. We're seeing everything in Charlottesville from a shoe company that can 3D print shoes to partnering on creating masks and the PPE needed. So we're seeing collaborations in the pharma industry that just haven't happened before. And right now it feels really good. It doesn't seem like anybody's working in a silo. They're all saying that the more we can put into this pipeline, the better we'll have a hit on success. And so it feels very collaborative from the pharma perspective, as well as general collaborations across the community. There's a company that's got an idea right now. It's just in concept, but I'm pretty excited about it. It's a way to identify pre-temperature inflammation that might be an indicator that disease's onset is incubated. And he has coordinated during his own furlough time the efforts of other local companies to pull together all the tools, the software needed for that, as well as the tools for a prototype. So, we're seeing those collaborations happening too. People are innovating because they're in this new time, and some do have more time on their hands. So I think that's also helpful.
Yeah.
I think there's an improved public perception about the role of biotech and pharma in our global health crisis, and I think that's a real positive out of the current environment. There's certainly skepticism and concern, and but I think on the whole, there's been improved perception, which has been much needed for the industry.
Yeah, when I think about that perception, first of all, I mean, I echo the sentiment about the collaborations and the desire of a lot of companies to just get help where it's needed. I get pretty fascinated by some of the companies that I get the chance to work with that either want to open source 3D printer files for everything from masks to like ventilator connectors or actual ventilators. They're taking these what could be very complicated machines that go through very rigorous approval and testing, and breaking it down into some of the more simpler parts so that people can 3D print, or hospitals with pretty standard commercial 3D printers can go and either print replacement parts or solve their own supply chain issues, essentially, for some of these things. And that's been pretty remarkable to see. There are certainly companies that are taking a good approach to helping with public perception on how life science and biotech industry can pull us all through this. You talk about Gilead and remdesivir. I was reading an article that came out around the fact that ICER went ahead and did a pricing analysis on remdesivir, and to try to start setting the stage for what will be a discussion around drug prices. Gilead's obviously donating their current stock for the trials and treatments, but it's one of those things that the public that I at least saw the news is very quick to pick up when you start talking about this idea of making money off of essentially life-saving treatments. And it's not a topic that a lot of people think very fondly of when they think of life science and pharmaceutical companies. But when you take a look at some of the data and the way that these drugs are developed, we've already talked about the rigor that these products have to go through to get to market. And at some point, at least you have some public watchdogs that are saying, here's what we think a reasonable price that you should charge for is. And as long as we can wrap the public's mind around, those concepts, I think it'll go well.
Yeah, I think this is a really unique time as well for that conversation, because if we're looking at the opportunity costs from an economic standpoint of lost productivity and certainly lost lives, which is just, you know, that's where the price of the drug, I think, can hopefully be more acceptable to the broader community. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a balance in all of that. But obviously these are very important drugs and vaccines being developed right now.
Tommy, can I just jump in for a second and just say this is one of the places where, again, I really admire Frank Gupton and his Medicines for All program. And I just noticed that the Richmond Times-Dispatch announced this morning that his startup company, Plow, got a $354 million contract from the federal government to make APIs for COVID-related activities. And I know one of Frank's real desires is to keep the price down. So kudos to him, kudos to his company, and kudos to Virginia.
Yeah, that was not missed by me this morning in the headlines.
Great.
So Nikki, I think you had pulled together some great numbers on what we're seeing right now and what you know, in the market. So
yeah, so out there right now, this is you know, just since a month ago, where we've seen another 40 new related clinical trials. These are total clinical trials, actually, not just in drugs, in the US. Globally, over 1,000 clinical trials related to COVID-19. So when you think about the timeline of innovation from concept to trial, whether it's repurposing or bringing studies to fruition, I think, you know, that's talking about that acceleration of the process. It's really unheard of. In the vaccine pipeline, obviously the latest news this week is the approval and success that Moderna has seen in their phase 1 mRNA vaccine. I think you know, they're accelerating and looking towards phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials already being set up. They've got manufacturing already in the pipeline, so they're definitely moving at light speed for that. And I think that, you know, there are 69 others right now in that list. So I think that's you know, a strong pipeline to be working from. I think interestingly, the next bullet is there's a lot of new technology out there that I think we should be cautiously optimistic about. And I think the success that Moderna saw with they saw 8 patients in a low dose positive response to the vaccine. But this is a technology. The mRNA vaccines have never been approved in humans for human use. So it's putting really everything into the bucket of innovation and acceptance. So, you know, we look forward to seeing how that all plays out. We're seeing the convalescence plasma treatment of antibodies. You know, that's certainly used for in other areas and indications, but you know, it hasn't been, you know, starting to be applied here. So we'll see how that may translate, and as well as biological antibodies being developed, and a lot of new technology associated with that. And I think, you know, it's something to be following, but also, you know, making sure we're asking the right questions as that's getting out there and approved, especially for the emergency authorization use and those early to the clinical trials. The SARS-1 vaccine, we were talking about the timelines again. Here's another one. There was 2 years timeline to first in human. So if we now look at the mRNA vaccine from Moderna, that was 4 months. So you know, we've been saying that technology has been accelerated, and you're actually seeing that in these development numbers, which is, you know, quite exciting to see right now when we need it the most. And John offered this nice statistic. There's been a 1/3 reduction in clinical trials overall. I think this is actually specific to cancer studies. So these are what we mentioned before, a delay in the current situation of other clinical trials that were either already in process or new ones to begin that are not COVID related. So looking ahead, I think we've talked on and already hit a bit on the improved public perception of pharma and biotech and the opportunities on pricing that will continue to drive that. And I think if there's great success out of everything that's being developed here, not just on the therapeutic side, but also innovation on the PPE supply side, our ability to respond to pandemics for the future, I think that will continue to heighten the perception of biotech as an industry in a whole. I think we will continue to see increased funding for healthcare innovation. We're hearing, there's still an interest here in Virginia for COVID-related innovations, but continued healthcare initiatives. And as an example, the Lighthouse Instruments Accelerator right now is accepting for healthcare innovations for the fall cohort. That's the first time they're doing that.
Yeah.
So there's already been this great momentum in the industry, both in Virginia and broadly, but I think it's bringing a lot more attention, and the funders are wanting to participate as well. VCs have remained relatively active. Might be some pause time right now as things are kind of re-emerging, and there's a little bit of a wait and see in this immediate current landscape, but I think for the long term, this looks like a strong outlook. I think we're going to see an adoption of new tools that are really informing the decision-making process and removing waste. So the operational additives that are within the process, we're now seeing we can be successful with acceleration of clinical trials, with acceleration of funding sources and reviews. And so, I guess the question is what's the pace in a standard environment? How do we get there? And I think the adoption of tools that can help to accelerate that process and give more informed decisions will help. So an example we have in Charlottesville is Archimedics has a platform for behavioral assessments using AI to understand clinical trial site readiness. So they can accelerate that process to bring higher success rates to those developing drugs and to the clinical trial process. And I think we'll see a higher adoption rate of those types of tools as we move forward.
Yeah.
And then just improved preparation for a healthcare crisis. We are clearly underprepared for this, shockingly so. And I think that in the future, you often over-respond to a situation, but I think that, as was alluded to earlier, we may be seeing these types of COVID coronavirus outbreaks happen again, whether it's 19 or others.
I remember at the very beginning of this, I read an article about the response that everybody was having to COVID-19, and as China was shutting down, and you saw that type of behavioral mindset spread toward the West and the European nations, and the lockdowns in Spain and Italy, and eventually to the various different flavors of lockdown here in the United States. It's an interesting thing to think about. I parallel it to what I do as an attorney. If I over-respond, big quotes on that, you never know if I got it right, because nothing happens, like you just keep going on about your business, and I think that's very much the same in health, it's hard to look back and say, did we overreact? It's hard to look back and say, well, nothing happened. Well, there might be a reason it didn't get as bad, and it's taking a look at those activities and understanding that, sometimes a heavy response is what you need in a certain situation. And when you look back at it, it may have looked really uncomfortable, and it may have looked really overblown, but that's probably because that response worked. Because at the end of the day, people didn't die, or more people didn't die, or more people didn't get infections, or the hospitals weren't overrun the way that we were fearing that they would be. That's certainly the case in some places that have been hit harder, but it's that preparation for future healthcare crisis, about learning these models and looking back and saying, was this the right approach? I think is going to be an important discussion as we go move past this.
Yeah, for sure. I think of Governor Northam's swift response to shutting down the state of Virginia, and pretty intense timeline put in there when he set the date at June 10th, and then others have been saying, well, we haven't really seen much in our area, or we're not seeing those increases, and almost to the point of complaint. But it's I think a response, like you said, you can't predict what would have happened otherwise. So same happening along the industry for sure.
So I'll go ahead and say that if anybody has any questions in the audience, go ahead and submit them through the Q&A. I have some questions here that we can talk about in the last few minutes that we have, and I'm interested in John's perspective on what, I think you touched on this a little bit, of what the new normal looks like, maybe in the academic sphere around drug discovery. What you think moving forward, we might be able to do to prevent whole labs from shutting down and keeping those pipelines on.
Yeah, I think we're still in the middle of the situation, so it's a little hard for me at least, to project what the new normal will look like. I'm sure that there'll be an increased sensitivity for safety, not that there wasn't safety before, but I think there's even a greater appreciation for ensuring that we don't spread infectious disease. I also think this is a period when team science has been emphasized, and so I think the reduction in silos will occur. I can tell you personally that I'm on weekly Zooms learning about what is SARS-CoV-2, never really having taken an infectious disease course in my life. It's been very eye-opening. So learning the importance of integrating diagnostics with therapeutics, and the theranostics area, I think, is another area. So I do think out of all of this, we will, the parlance will be shared among people from different disciplines. So those are some of my thoughts. Maybe Nikki has some thoughts from her vantage point.
Yeah, I've been a part of a lot of local economic development discussions about re-emerging in our economy. We have a coordinated effort across our localities here called Project Rebound, and have been on a lot of conversations that are beyond just the biotech industry, but it's really how do we even get to the new normal is the immediate need. And we've had a lot of discussions about what kinds of guidelines each business might want to be adopting and bringing into supporting the safe practices. And there's a lot of fear and concern, especially from the small businesses that are interacting with customers. But I think what the biotech community can offer are some of those operational best practices as a guidance for others to adopt and bring into their own organizations that make sense. We said, there are safety practices and ways of operating that are the current norm in the industry. So I think that's something that this industry can offer to our broader community effort in getting to the new normal, because there's a lot of need.
I get one of the something I've learned over the past couple of years is the pharmaceutical industry very much stays almost disconnected from the device industry to a certain degree, and I'm seeing a lot of that, especially with what you just talked about, Nikki, in your previous slides, with these med tech companies and more connected devices playing a role in actually enhancing clinical trial designs, or making decentralized clinical trials actually possible, where you can remotely monitor. I think, John, you brought that up as well, as being able to remotely monitor these patients, being able to track data, and being able to integrate the data into some meaningful, compliant e-source platforms that allow people to participate in these clinical studies from afar and not bringing them on site all the time, or being able to enter into communities that are not home to a giant research university, or you know, could be, but actually have populations that would probably benefit from having data collected to include them in the cohort of people who are researched in these studies. So from my perspective, I think, you know, the FDA for such a long time has been asking for e-source and allow it. I think there's still some perception that it's not readily accepted by the FDA. But I do think this is going to be the time where perception shifts, that, you know, bringing in more of that, more of the devices and more of the health tech platforms could really help out here. Is that something that either one of you think could is probably in the new normal scope?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit, Tommy, if you recall, on the adoption rate of telehealth activities. And we've seen this specifically in our region, where there are two different companies. Caretaker Medical can take vital signs through remote monitoring of inpatient with an inpatient system. And another can do outpatient with Locus Health is the company that can do outpatient testing. Gotcha. And you know, both have been working really hard to gain traction at the hospitals and in the clinical setting. And just with the release of 5 CPT codes during this environment, they have seen an uptick in acceptance. Obviously, the need now to have separation from the caregivers and the patients has enabled this technology, and has enabled it all to happen. But you know, we talked about telehealth and the medical delivery of healthcare to patients is likely to change, and as a result of all of this.
Yeah.
And I think also the other thing that this whole experience has emphasized is how important it is to have broadband service and be able to access the internet. Yeah. And for our citizens that are in the southwestern part of the state, more rural areas, yeah. I think one of the things you're going to see is an emphasis on making sure that that infrastructure is enhanced to enable the kinds of interactions that people that are in more urban areas are sort of used to.
Yeah, and I remember I went to school in Virginia Tech, and I remember, I think it's one of the counties out there that there's a doctor day where, like, I think it's on like maybe a once a month or once every quarter type of thing, where a doctor actually travels. There's no doctor in the county, and so a doctor comes in and people line up to get healthcare or to get seen. And I think that there's kind of a disconnect at this point for people who are living in more populated areas, suburbs, urban, to understand that there are still communities out there without the access to healthcare that would either enable them to, and they probably have a lot of comorbidities that enhance disease progression, or, you know, they have things that aren't just particularly studied. So being able to connect in those communities and get data and include them in the healthcare system, I think is going to be really important at one point. So yeah, well, I think we have run up against our hour and probably gone a little bit over, but I definitely appreciate you guys sticking around and talking through these issues. So I want to say thank you again, John, Nikki. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. I look forward to working more with you in the coming months as we talk more about how we can emerge on the other side of this in a better position than we were going into it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, Tommy.
Yes, thank you, Tommy.
Thank you. You have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.